The first set of options we come to in our render properties panel is the dimensions. And this is where we set the size or resolution of the render output. So here the X slider is the width of the frame, but you notice that the behavior in the viewport maybe isn't exactly what you would expect, but it's just an adaptive way that the frame resizes. It is accurate to what the pixel value is. And then the Y value changes the height. And below that, we have a percentage slider, which is excellent for quickly resizing relatively. And so if I wanted to do a smaller version of this frame for preview purposes, you can see that that rendered very quickly. It gives me an idea of the composition and the render settings, but at a fraction of the render time that it would take to render the full resolution. Let's say I'm happy with that, then just bump it up to 100% and render the final result. Or also I can go above 100% to 200 and make it twice as big. It's a pretty useful setting. And then below that we have the aspect ratio, which visually does kind of the same thing as the resolution sliders, except we can't go below 1. And we can use the presets up here at the top to make better sense of these settings. So the default is set to HD 1080p. We also have 720p, which establishes the resolution and the aspect ratio. DVC Pro HD 1080p. That one will automatically set the aspect ratio to 3:2. And so these are pretty standard presets and they're always helpful. To the right side of the panel, we have the frame range, which is for animation, and it determines the size of the timeline down here at the bottom. And so if we take the end frame down, you can see the timeline start to shrink. And below that, we have the frame rate, pretty typical FPS frame per second values. Again, important for animation. Then we have a time remapping setting that's more advanced and for another lesson. Over here at the bottom left, we have two toggles, and this first one called border. If I enable that, you see that we get a red dotted line around the frame of our camera. And if I enable viewport rendering, you can see that we are only rendering inside of this frame. And this can speed up the preview render because we're not rendering the unnecessary surrounding parts of the scene. But if I leave the camera view, we start to render everything again. And then beside the border toggle, which doesn't do anything unless we draw a render region. So we can do that with Shift B, as in boy. And let's draw a little box around our cup here. And this defines a smaller area to render within the overall frame. And so if I choose to render this, and zoom out to see the overall frame, you can see that it gives us the full resolution filled in by this checker pattern around our actual render region, which is kind of skewed thanks to that 3:2 aspect ratio. But if I enable crop and switch to slot number 2 and render that again, here we have just the render region without the rest of the frame surrounding it. And that's really all for the dimensions section of our render properties. I think I'll switch back to the standard HD TV 1080p setting. And notice that over here on the right side, we can add our own presets. So if we establish resolution and aspect ratio settings that we like, just hit the plus button, name it whatever you want, and click OK. The next section I want to cover is this stamp. And so we'll enable that and open the drop down. And then we'll Shift B to select the rest of our frame to get rid of that render region. And in order to do that, you notice I had to draw the box around the camera frame, which will actually disable that border checkbox. So we'll re-enable that. And now if I do a render, you can see very small at the top and bottom because I rendered my frame at full 1080p. I should have dropped the percentage down a little bit, but if I click the 1 key on the number pad, we have a few lines of information pertaining to this render that has been stamped onto our frame. So you can see here the file path of, it's either the image or it's actually the blend file. Then we've also got the date and time of the render, as well as the duration of the render time. And then down at the bottom, we have some scene information like the time code in the animation, frame of the animation, the active camera, and let's see, I think that's it. No, actually the name of the scene. And so in our stamp options, we have control of what size this font is. We can define the text color, as well as the background, which is this bar that's set behind our text. So it's a black color with 0.25 as an alpha value. And below that, we can enable or disable whatever type of information that we want to be stamped on, including at the bottom an optional note, which is custom text. So let's say this is a smaller preview render, and then we'll change the dimensions to 20%. Let's go to 50%. Let's render that again. And now let's see where that note appears. Right here below the path to the blend file, we can see our custom note. And so this is a valuable setting for organizing your renders, especially in a production environment.